The P-26 Shooter was America's first all-metal monoplane fighter. It looked fast with its open cockpit and fixed landing gear, but by 1941 it was a flying relic. It carried only 2 machine guns and lacked the speed to catch modern threats. It was the brave, outdated gatekeeper of an era that vanished overnight at Pearl Harbor. The Seversky P-35 represented the transition to modern air combat. It featured retractable landing gear and an enclosed cockpit, which were revolutionary in the mid-1930s. However, it was underpowered and lightly armed compared to the early Zero fighters. Most were destroyed in the Philippines, serving as a final lesson in the cost of falling behind. The Curtiss P-36 Hawk was a robust fighter that saw more combat with foreign air forces than its own. It was agile and reliable, but its radial engine struggled at high altitudes. While it fought bravely during the opening minutes of the Pearl Harbor attack, it was quickly overshadowed by its successor. It proved that agility alone could not win. The Brewster F-2A Buffalo is often remembered as America's greatest steel mistake. It was overweight and mechanically unreliable, which made it an easy target for Japanese pilots in the Pacific. While it served successfully in Finnish hands, it was a death trap for American crews. It became a symbol of the desperate need for better design. The Republic P-43 Lancer was a high-altitude stepping stone. It introduced turbo-supercharging technology that would later make the P-47 a legend. Though it was fast and could fly high, it lacked the self-sealing fuel tanks and armor required for combat. It was relegated to photo reconnaissance and training while the industry learned from its flaws. The Vultee P-66 Vanguard was the backup defender that nobody wanted. Originally built for export, it was pressed into service when frontline fighters were in short supply. It was a mediocre design with average performance and limited firepower. Most ended up in China or as trainers far from the main action, proving that mass production requires quality. The Curtiss P-40 Warhawk became the iconic face of early American resistance. From the Flying Tigers in China to the deserts of North Africa, it was the rugged workhorse that held the line. It couldn't outclimb or outturn its rivals, but it could absorb incredible damage and dive like a bullet. It was the fighter that refused to quit. The Bell P-39 Airacobra moved the engine behind the pilot to fit a massive 37mm cannon in the nose. While American pilots struggled with its poor high-altitude performance, the Soviet Union loved it for ground attack. It was a low-altitude predator that tore through tanks and bombers alike. It proved that unique engineering requires the right mission. The Lockheed P-38 Lightning was the fork-tailed devil of the Pacific. Its twin-engine design gave it incredible range and speed, making it the ultimate interceptor. With all its guns concentrated in the nose, it could shred targets with surgical precision. It was the aircraft that claimed the lives of Japan's top admirals and secured the island chains. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt was the unstoppable flying jug. It was one of the largest and heaviest fighters of the war, built around a massive radial engine. It could carry a bomb load equivalent to a light bomber and was virtually impossible to shoot down. When this 8-gun monster appeared in the sky, the German army had nowhere to hide. The North American P-51 Mustang changed the course of history. By pairing an American airframe with a British Merlin engine, the Allies gained a fighter that could fly to Berlin and back. It provided the long-range escort that saved the bomber fleets from total destruction. It was the sleek silver master of the European skies. The Bell P-63 King Cobra was the bigger and faster evolution of the Airacobra. It addressed the P-39's flaws with a much better engine and improved wing design. Like its predecessor, it was largely ignored by the U.S. Army but became a legendary tank killer in the hands of the Soviet Air Force. It was a specialized beast built for the Eastern Front. The Northrop P-61 Black Widow was the war's first dedicated night fighter. This twin-engine assassin carried a massive radar in its nose to hunt enemies in total darkness. With 4 20mm cannons and 4 machine guns, it was the most heavily armed fighter of its time. It proved that in modern war, there is no safety in the dark. The Vultee XP-54 Swoosh Goose was a bizarre experiment in pusher propeller design. Its inverted gull wing and downward ejecting seat made it look like science fiction. But the performance was a disaster. It was far too heavy for its engine and suffered from constant mechanical failures. One prototype was enough to prove this goose would never lead the flock. The Curtiss-Wright X-P-55 Ascender was a tail-first flop that tried to reinvent the fighter. By placing the wings and engine at the rear, it was supposed to offer superior visibility and speed. Instead, it proved to be dangerously unstable and prone to stalling at low speeds. It was a radical idea that crashed into the reality of aerodynamic limits. The Northrop P-56 Black Bullet was a tailless flying wing attempt at a fighter. It was small, fast, and looked like a silver bullet, but it was nearly impossible to control. Its short fuselage and lack of vertical surfaces made it a pilot's nightmare. After 2 crashes, the program was buried as a warning against chasing speed without stability. The Curtiss P-60 was a series of 5 different prototypes that led to absolutely nothing. Curtiss tried to upgrade the aging P-40 design with different engines and wings, but every version was inferior to the Mustang or Thunderbolt. It was a multi-million-dollar lesson in the danger of trying to fix an obsolete airframe instead of starting fresh. The McDonnell P-67 Bat was a stunningly beautiful aircraft that failed its flight tests. Its blended wing and fuselage design was ahead of its time, but the engines constantly overheated. During a test flight, the prototype caught fire and was destroyed, ending the dream of a futuristic interceptor. It remains a masterpiece of design that simply could not fly. The Fisher P-75 Eagle was a Frankenstein fighter built from the parts of other planes. It used the tail of a Douglas SBD and the wings of a P-40 to save time, but the result was a heavy, uncoordinated mess. It was slower than the planes it was meant to replace. It proved that you cannot build a world-class fighter with leftovers. The Republic XP-72 was the Super Thunderbolt that arrived too late. It was designed to use a massive 4-row radial engine and could have reached speeds over 500 miles per hour. While it promised incredible performance, the emergence of jet engines made high-performance piston fighters obsolete overnight. It was a peak of technology with nowhere to go. The consolidated XP-81 was a mixed power failure that used both a turboprop and a jet engine. The idea was to combine the efficiency of a propeller with the speed of a jet for long-range escort missions. In practice, it was overly complex and underpowered in both departments. The program was canceled as the Air Force realized pure jets were the future. The Grumman F-4F Wildcat was the gritty guardian of the early Pacific War. It was slower than the Japanese Zero, but it was built like a tank and featured folding wings for carrier storage. By using superior tactics and heavy armor, American pilots held the line at Midway. It was the tough survivor that kept the Navy in the fight. The Grumman F-6F Hellcat was the ultimate ace-maker. Designed specifically to kill the Zero, it featured massive power and 6 50-caliber machine guns. It claimed over 5,000 enemy kills during its service life, more than any other naval fighter. It was the hammer that broke the back of the Imperial Japanese Navy. The Vought F-4U Corsair was known as the Whistling Death. Its distinctive inverted gull wing allowed for a massive propeller and incredible speed. While it was difficult to land on carriers early on, it became the terror of the Pacific in the hands of the Marines. It was a high-performance predator that stayed in service long after the war. The Grumman F-7F Tiger Cat was a twin-engine beast that was too powerful for most carrier decks. It was designed for the Midway-class carriers and featured incredible climb rates and heavy firepower. While it arrived too late to see major combat in World War II, it proved that naval aviation was reaching the limits of piston-powered speed. The Grumman F-8F Bearcat was the absolute peak of piston engine technology. It was built small and light around the most powerful engine available to create a climb rate that still impresses today. It was designed to intercept kamikazes, but the war ended before it could enter combat. It was a specialized racing machine dressed in war paint. The Bell P-59 Airacobra was America's secret entry into the jet age. It was designed in total silence and used 2 General Electric engines, but its performance was surprisingly poor. It was actually slower than many top-tier piston fighters of the time. While it never saw combat, it provided the essential training for the first generation of jet pilots. The Lockheed P-80 Shooting Star was the first true American production jet. It featured a sleek design and a single powerful engine that pushed it past 500 miles per hour. While a few were sent to Europe before the surrender, they didn't engage in combat. It was the aircraft that finally closed the book on the propeller era. The Ryan FR-1 Fireball was a strange hybrid for the carrier deck. It used a piston engine in the front for cruising and a jet engine in the back for combat speed. This mixed power setup was meant to solve the early jet problems of slow takeoff, Only 66 were built before the Navy realized pure jets were ready for sea. The McDonnell FH-1 Phantom was the beginning of the naval jet era. It was the first pure jet to land on an American aircraft carrier and marked the end of the piston engine's reign at sea. Though its performance was modest compared to later designs, it proved that the future of the fleet would be powered by turbines. The age of the jet had arrived. The Boeing XB-15 was a 1937 experimental leap into long-range bombing. It featured a 149-foot wingspan and 4 engines. Though only one prototype was built, it carried 2,500 pounds of bombs over 5,000 miles. This massive aircraft validated the intercontinental concepts that defined American aviation for decades. The Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress entered service in 1938 as the backbone of daylight precision bombing. It carried 4,500 pounds of bombs and bristled with 13 machine guns for defense. Over 12,000 were built during the war. The 8th Air Force suffered a staggering 47% loss rate in the skies over Europe. The consolidated B-24 Liberator arrived in 1941 and became the most produced American military aircraft in history. With over 18,000 units built, it carried 8,000 pounds of bombs at 290 miles per hour. Its high-efficiency wing gave it superior range for hunting submarines and bombing oil fields. It proved industrial might could overwhelm any enemy. The Douglas X B-19 first flew in 1941 as the largest American aircraft built before World War II. Weighing 162,000 pounds, this giant could carry over 37,000 pounds of bombs. Only one prototype was ever built because it was too slow and expensive for mass production. It pushed engineering boundaries that directly benefited post-war cargo designs. The Boeing YB-40 Flying Fortress was an experimental gunship escort designed to protect B-17 formations. It carried 14 machine guns and 11,000 rounds of ammunition instead of a bomb load. The concept failed in 1943 because the heavy gunship couldn't keep up with standard bombers after they dropped their loads. Long-range fighters eventually solved the escort problem. The Boeing B-29 Superfortress revolutionized war in 1944 with pressurized cabins and atomic capabilities. It carried 20,000 pounds of bombs at 350 miles per hour to targets 3,000 miles away. This aircraft firebombed Japanese cities and dropped the atomic bombs. It represented a technological quantum leap that no other nation could match in 1945. The consolidated B-32 Dominator entered service in 1944 as a backup plan in case the B-29 failed. It carried 20,000 pounds of bombs and flew at 357 miles per hour. Only 118 were built, and just 15 saw combat in the Pacific. A B-32 flew the final American combat mission of World War II on August 18, 1945. The Boeing B-50 Superfortress was an improved 1947 variant featuring more powerful engines. It could carry 20,000 pounds of bombs over 4,600 miles. In 1949, the Lucky Lady II completed the first non-stop flight around the world using aerial refueling. It served as America's primary nuclear deterrent until the jet age fully arrived. The Convair B-36 Peacemaker was the largest mass-produced piston-engine aircraft ever built. Commissioned in 1949, it featured 10 engines and a 230-foot wingspan. It could carry 86,000 pounds of bombs over 10,000 miles without refueling. Known as 6 turning and 4 burning, it was the ultimate Cold War insurance policy. The Convair XB-46 was a jet bomber prototype that first flew in 1947. It featured a slender design and could carry 22,000 pounds of bombs at 545 miles per hour. Only one prototype was built before losing the competition to Boeing's superior B-47. The failure of this program pushed Convair to develop the supersonic B-58 instead. The Martin X B-48 was another 1947 jet prototype competing for Air Force contracts. It featured 6 engines and an unusual bicycle landing gear configuration. While it carried 22,000 pounds of bombs, its design limited operational flexibility compared to its rivals. The program was canceled in 1950 after the Air Force chose the B-47 design. The Northrop B-49 was a 1947 jet-powered flying wing derived from Piston designs. It offered exceptional range and early radar stealth potential with 8 turbojet engines. Stability problems and a fatal crash eventually doomed the program in 1950. Northrop would later use these lessons to create the B-2 Spirit 40 years later. The North American B-45 Tornado became America's first operational jet bomber in 1948. It carried 22,000 pounds of bombs at 579 miles per hour. During the Korean War, it proved its worth in deep strike reconnaissance roles over North Korea and China. It was a successful first step, but it was soon overshadowed by the B-47. The Boeing B-47 Stratojet revolutionized aviation in 1951. With swept wings and podded engines, it became the most produced jet bomber in history with over 2,000 units built. Flying at 607 miles per hour, its design influenced every future jet from the B-52 to modern airliners. It proved that revolutionary design wins wars. The Convair YB-60 arrived in 1952 as a jet-powered evolution of the massive B-36. It featured 8 engines and could carry 72,000 pounds of bombs. Despite its size, it lost the direct competition to the smaller but higher-performing Boeing B-52. Convair scrapped the program immediately after the Air Force chose the Stratofortress. The Boeing B-52 Stratofortress is the longest-serving bomber in aviation history, entering service in 1955. It carries 70,000 pounds of bombs over 8,800 miles with 8 engines. Designed to be obsolete by 1980, it still flies combat missions today. The Air Force plans to keep this legend operational until 2050. The Convair B-58 Hustler was the world's first supersonic bomber, entering service in 1960. It could dash at Mach 2.0 and set 19 world speed records. While beautiful and fast, its astronomical operating costs led to a short 10-year career. It proved that extreme speed comes at a very high price. The North American XB-70 Valkyrie was a Mach 3 masterpiece designed to fly at 70,000 feet. It featured a unique folding delta wing for supersonic stability. Advanced Soviet surface-to-air missiles made high-altitude bombing obsolete before it could enter production. Only 2 prototypes were built before the program was canceled in 1961. The General Dynamics FB-111A entered service in 1967 as a swing-wing strategic bomber. It was designed for high-speed, low-altitude penetration to evade Soviet radar at Mach 2.5. It carried over 37,000 pounds of bombs and served until 1996. It represented a successful tactical compromise after the Mach 3 dream died. The Rockwell B-1A was a supersonic prototype first flown in 1974 to replace the B-52. It was designed to reach Mach 2.2 and carry 75,000 pounds of bombs. President Carter canceled the program in 1977 in favor of cruise missiles and the stealth program. Though it never entered production, it set the stage for the B-1B. The Rockwell B-1B Lancer entered service in 1986. Optimized for low-altitude penetration instead of high-speed dash, it carries 75,000 pounds of ordnance and features a reduced radar signature. The Lancer has dropped more bombs in Iraq and Afghanistan than any other bomber. It remains a critical backbone of modern American strike power. The Northrop B-2 Spirit became the world's first operational stealth bomber in 1989. Its flying wing design and radar-absorbent materials make it virtually invisible to enemy defenses. Only 21 were built at a cost of $2.2 billion each. It has opened every major American air campaign since 1999 with total impunity. The Northrop Grumman B-21 Raider is America's next-generation stealth bomber, first flying in 2023. It incorporates decades of stealth lessons while costing significantly less than the B-2. At least 100 Raiders are planned to replace the B-1 and B-2 fleets by 2030. It represents the future of penetrating strikes against advanced air defenses. Brewster F-2A Buffalo. The Buffalo is often remembered as the flying coffin of the Pacific. It was designed as a modern monoplane for the Navy, but by the time the war started, it was overweight, unstable, and hopelessly outclassed by the Japanese Zero. Its landing gear was notorious for collapsing during carrier landings. However, in a strange twist of fate, the Finnish Air Force loved the Buffalo, using it to achieve incredible kill ratios against Soviet pilots by stripping away the heavy naval gear. In American hands, it was a death trap. Bell P-39. Airacobra. The P-39 was a radical design with the engine placed behind the pilot to accommodate a massive 37mm cannon in the nose. It looked futuristic, but it had a fatal flaw. It lacked a turbo supercharger. This meant above 12,000 feet, The Airacobra was gasping for air and completely helpless. It also had a terrifying tendency to enter a flat spin if the center of gravity shifted. Despite being rejected by the British, it found a home in the Soviet Union where its low-altitude performance and heavy cannon made it a legendary tank buster. Curtiss Wright CW-21 Demon. The Demon was an interceptor designed for pure climb rate. It was incredibly light and fast for its time, but that speed came at a cost. It had zero armor and no self-sealing fuel tanks. It was basically a racing plane with machine guns. When the Japanese invaded the Dutch East Indies, the CW-21s were shredded in minutes. It was a glass cannon that broke before it could ever fire a shot. Curtiss P-40 Warhawk early variants. While the P-40 became a hero with the Flying Tigers, the early A and B models were mediocre at best. They were heavy, lacked high-altitude performance, and couldn't outturn anything the Axis flew. Their only saving grace was their ruggedness and high diving speed. In the early days of 1941, American pilots were forced to fight a defensive war in a plane that was already 5 years behind the curve. Vultee P-66 Vanguard. The P-66 was a plane looking for a home. Originally built for Sweden, it was confiscated by the U.S. after the war broke out. It was fast and agile, but its narrow landing gear caused constant ground loops and crashes. It ended up being sent to China, where it performed poorly and was often confused for Japanese aircraft by friendly anti-aircraft crews. It was a fighter that was more dangerous to its own pilots than the enemy. Republic P-43 Lancer. The Lancer was the awkward middle child between the P-35 and the legendary P-47 Thunderbolt. It featured a turbo supercharger that gave it great high-altitude performance, but the fuel system was a disaster. The tanks leaked constantly, and the plane was prone to catching fire. It was relegated to photo reconnaissance and training because no commander wanted to send pilots into combat in a flying tinderbox. Bell P-63 King Cobra. The King Cobra was Bell's attempt to fix everything wrong with the P-39. It was faster, bigger, and better at altitude, but the U.S. Army Air Corps already had the P-51 Mustang. With no mission in American service, almost the entire production run was sent to the Soviet Union. It was a good plane that arrived too late and was eclipsed by the true legends of the war. Bell P-59 Aerocomet. The P-59 was America's first jet, but it was a massive disappointment. It was actually slower than many contemporary propeller fighters like the P-51 or P-47. The early jet engines were underpowered and unreliable. While it provided valuable data for jet flight training, it was so poor in performance that it was never cleared for combat. It remains a historic footnote of a transition that started with a stumble. Ryan F.R. Fireball. The Fireball was a bizarre hybrid, a piston engine in the front and a jet engine in the back. The idea was to have the reliability of a prop for carrier takeoffs and the speed of a jet for combat. In reality, the plane was structurally weak. Several aircraft literally broke in half during carrier landings. It was a complex solution to a problem that was better solved by pure jet designs like the FH Phantom. Convair XP-81. This was another hybrid experiment using a turboprop in the nose and a turbojet in the tail. It was designed as a long-range escort, but the technology was far from ready. The turboprop engine was a nightmare to maintain, and the plane was incredibly heavy. By the time they ironed out the bugs, the war was over, and the jet age had moved far beyond this mechanical chimera. Douglas P-70 Nighthawk. When the U.S. needed a night fighter fast, they took an A-20 Havoc bomber and stuffed it with radar and cannons. The result was the P-70. It was heavy, slow to climb, and its radar was often broken. It was so sluggish that it struggled to catch enemy bombers, which was its only job. It served as a stopgap until the P-61 Black Widow arrived, but it was largely ineffective in the dark skies of the Pacific. Lockheed XP-58 Chain Lightning. The Chain Lightning was supposed to be a massive, heavily armed version of the P-38. It went through endless design changes, from a tank buster to a high-altitude interceptor. By the time the prototype flew, it was 5 tons overweight and the engines were constantly failing. It was a victim of requirement creep, where the military kept asking for more until the plane couldn't fly at all. Fisher P-75 Eagle. The P-75 is the ultimate example of why you don't build a plane out of spare parts. Fisher Body tried to combine the wings of a P-40, the tail of an A-24, and the landing gear of an F-4U. The result was a Frankenstein monster that was unstable and slower than the planes it was made from. It was a colossal waste of money and resources that was canceled after only a handful were built. Curtiss P-60. The P-60 was Curtiss-Wright's desperate attempt to stay relevant. They kept iterating on the P-40 design, changing engines and wings over and over. Each version was just as mediocre as the last. While the Mustang and Thunderbolt were winning the war, Curtiss was stuck in a loop of failed prototypes. It was the Groundhog Day of aviation history. McDonnell X P-67 Bat. The Bat was one of the most beautiful planes ever built, designed with a blended wing body for maximum aerodynamics, but beauty didn't translate to performance. The engines ran so hot they frequently caught fire, and the plane never reached its projected speeds. During a test flight, the prototype was destroyed by an engine fire, ending the life of this futuristic but flawed interceptor. Vultee XP-54 Swooze Goose. The Swooze Goose was a pusher prop design where the pilot sat in a pressurized cockpit and entered through a literal elevator. It was heavy, slow, and the complex engine cooling system never worked properly. It looked like something out of a sci-fi comic, but it lacked the performance to even match the fighters already in service. Curtiss XP-55 Ascender. The Ascender was a canard design with the small wings in the front and the engine in the back. It was intended to be highly maneuverable, but it turned out to be dangerously unstable. It had a habit of stalling and entering an unrecoverable flip. The name Ascender became a joke among pilots who called it the Assender because the engine was in the rear. Northrop P-56 Black Bullet. The Black Bullet was a tailless flying wing powered by a massive radial engine. It was made of magnesium, which is highly flammable. The plane was incredibly difficult to handle, and the first prototype was destroyed when a tire blew out, causing it to cartwheel. It was an ambitious attempt at a radical shape that the technology of 1943 simply couldn't support. Grumman XF-5F Skyrocket. The Skyrocket had a unique look with its nose starting behind the leading edge of the wings. It was supposed to be a high-performance naval interceptor with incredible visibility. However, it suffered from cooling issues and landing gear problems. While it was fast, the Navy decided it was too complex for carrier operations and chose the F-4U Corsair instead. Curtiss XP-46. The XP-46 was intended to be the successor to the P-40. It was smaller and sleeker, but by the time the prototype flew, it was already slower than the improved P-40D. It offered no significant advantage and was immediately abandoned. It was a classic case of a replacement being worse than the original. Tucker XP-57. Designed by a car company, the XP-57 was supposed to be a lightweight pea-shooter made of steel. The idea was to build a fighter that didn't use critical aluminum, but the engine never arrived and the company went bankrupt. It remains a paper project that proved car manufacturers should probably stick to the road. Bell XP-77. The XP-77 was a tiny fighter made almost entirely of wood. It was an emergency design in case aluminum became scarce. It was so small that it was difficult to fly and extremely cramped. Once it was clear that the U.S. had plenty of aluminum, the wooden fighter was seen as a relic and scrapped. It was a solution to a problem that never happened. The story of the American fighter in World War II is often told through its victories, but these 22 failures are just as important. They represent the trial and error, the mechanical risks, and the hard lessons learned in the pursuit of air supremacy. Without the failure of the Buffalo, we might not have appreciated the Hellcat. Without the struggle of the P-39, we might not have perfected the Mustang. Every failure was a stepping stone toward the dominance of the American sky.